Three grown men corner a 16-year-old kid at a public park in broad daylight. The teenager is alone, sitting on a bench reading a book, wearing headphones, looking like the easiest target they've seen all day. The leader of the group, a man twice the kid's size, towers over him, demanding his phone and wallet. Here's what they didn't know. That quiet teenager reading philosophy on a park bench had spent the last 8 years training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Muay Thai under one of the most respected martial arts instructors in the country. What happened in the next 90 seconds was captured on a bystander's phone camera, went viral with over 40 million views, and sparked a national conversation about self-defense, bullying, and why underestimating people based on appearance is always a mistake. But the real story, the one that makes this more than just another viral fight video, is what this teenager did after he defended himself, and how his response transformed not just his own life, but potentially saved the lives of the men who tried to rob him. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll understand why true strength has nothing to do with violence and everything to do with character. Let me introduce you to Daniel Kim, because understanding what happened in that park requires knowing who Daniel was before that confrontation turned him into an internet sensation. Daniel grew up in Portland, Oregon, the son of Korean immigrant parents who ran a small grocery store in a neighborhood that had seen better days. His childhood was shaped by watching his parents work 16-hour days, by witnessing his father get robbed 3 times in 5 years, and by experiencing the particular vulnerability that comes from being visibly different in a community where difference often invited aggression. When Daniel was 8 years old, his father was hospitalized after being attacked during a robbery at their store. The physical injuries healed, but something changed in their family after that night. Daniel's mother insisted that her son learn to protect himself, not out of desire for him to become violent, but out of the desperate hope that he'd never feel as helpless as his father had felt lying on the floor of his own store while strangers took everything he'd worked for. Daniel's parents enrolled him in Master Carlos Rivera's Martial Arts Academy, a no-frills gym in an industrial part of Portland where serious fighters trained alongside kids learning discipline and self-defense. Master Rivera was a legend in martial arts circles, a third-degree Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt who'd competed professionally and a Muay Thai instructor who'd trained champions. But what made Rivera special wasn't his fighting credentials. It was his philosophy about why people should learn martial arts in the first place. Rivera taught that the goal of learning to fight was to never have to fight. That true martial arts mastery meant having the confidence to de-escalate situations and the wisdom to know when violence was truly necessary versus when ego was driving aggression. He drilled into his students that being able to hurt someone carried the responsibility of choosing not to, except in genuine self-defense. Daniel absorbed these lessons along with the physical techniques, training 4 days a week for 8 years, earning his blue belt in jiu-jitsu and advancing through the Muay Thai rankings while maintaining honor roll grades at school. By age 16, Daniel had become the kind of martial artist that instructors love, technically skilled but humble, confident but not arrogant, capable of significant violence but possessing the discipline to control that capability. He'd never been in a real fight outside the gym, had never used his training to show off or intimidate anyone, and most people who knew him casually had no idea he could fight at all. Daniel was quiet, bookish, more interested in philosophy and history than in demonstrating toughness. He wore glasses, carried books everywhere, and had the kind of gentle demeanor that made bullies throughout his school years assume he was weak. He'd been pushed around, had his lunch money stolen, been mocked for his accent and his appearance. And through it all he'd maintained the discipline that Master Rivera had instilled. Walk away when possible, de-escalate when necessary, fight only as a last resort when physical safety was genuinely threatened. On the afternoon of June 3, 2023, Daniel was at Laurelhurst Park, a popular public space in southeast Portland where families picnicked, joggers ran loops, and teenagers hung out. Daniel had gone there alone to read and think, something he did regularly when he needed space from the cramped apartment where his family lived. He was sitting on a bench near the basketball courts, deep into a philosophy book about ethics and moral responsibility, when 3 men approached him. These weren't teenagers. They were adults in their 20s and early 30s, and they were clearly looking for easy targets to rob. According to witness statements and security footage from nearby businesses, These same three men had been operating in Portland parks for several weeks, targeting people who appeared vulnerable and stealing phones, wallets, and other valuables. They'd been successful because they relied on intimidation and numbers, approaching victims aggressively enough that most people simply handed over their belongings rather than risk getting hurt. The leader of the group, later identified as Marcus Webb, was 6'3" and easily 240 pounds. He approached Daniel's bench with his two accomplices flanking him, and his opening move was pure intimidation. He kicked Daniel's backpack, scattering his belongings, and demanded that Daniel empty his pockets. Daniel looked up from his book, assessed the situation with the kind of calm that 8 years of martial arts training provides, and made his first attempt at de-escalation. He spoke quietly, respectfully, saying he didn't want any trouble and asking them to please leave him alone. This response, calm instead of frightened, respectful instead of submissive, seemed to confuse and then anger Webb. In Webb's experience, victims showed fear, and that fear made them compliant. Daniel's composure looked like defiance, and Webb responded by escalating. He grabbed Daniel's book, threw it aside, and shoved Daniel's shoulder hard enough to knock him back against the bench. What happened next is where Daniel's training and Master Rivera's philosophy were put to their ultimate test. Daniel stood up slowly, his hands visible and non-threatening, and tried de-escalation again. He told Webb he could take the backpack, that there was nothing in it worth getting hurt over, that they should just take what they wanted and leave. But Webb had committed now to asserting dominance, and Daniel's continued calm seemed to enrage him further. Webb grabbed Daniel by the shirt, pulled him close in a threatening gesture meant to terrify, and that's when Webb made his critical mistake. He threw a punch. It wasn't a particularly skilled punch, more of a wild swing fueled by anger and the assumption that this skinny kid with glasses would crumble from a single hit. Daniel moved. Not dramatically, not with the flashy techniques you see in movies, but with the efficient precision of someone who drilled defensive responses thousands of times. He slipped the punch, the kind of subtle head movement that made Webb's fist whistle past his ear, and in that moment of Webb's overextension and imbalance, Daniel saw no other option but to defend himself. The entire confrontation, from the moment Webb threw that first punch to the moment all three attackers were on the ground, lasted approximately 87 seconds. A bystander named Jennifer Morrison, who'd been at the park with her children, had started recording on her phone when she saw the confrontation developing, initially planning to have evidence if she needed to call police. What her camera captured became one of the most widely analyzed self-defense videos in recent history. Daniel's response to Webb's attack was textbook defensive fighting. He didn't pursue, didn't escalate beyond what was necessary to protect himself, and the moment each attacker was no longer a threat, he disengaged. When Webb threw that first punch and Daniel slipped it, Daniel responded with a precise counter. A straight punch to Webb's solar plexus that knocked the wind out of him and doubled him over. As Webb gasped for air, one of his accomplices rushed Daniel from the side. Daniel saw him coming, stepped offline, and used the attacker's momentum against him, executing a simple hip throw that sent the man crashing to the ground. The third attacker hesitated, suddenly recognizing that this wasn't going as planned, but Webb had recovered enough to come at Daniel again, now furious and embarrassed. Webb charged like a linebacker, and Daniel did something that highlights the difference between movie fighting and real martial arts. He didn't meet force with force. Instead, Daniel dropped his level, shot under Webb's charge, and took him down with a basic but perfectly executed double-leg takedown. Once on the ground, Daniel established positional control, securing Webb in what's called side control, a position where Daniel had complete dominance while Webb could do nothing but exhaust himself trying to escape. Daniel didn't strike him on the ground, didn't rain down punches or try to hurt him. He simply controlled him, holding him immobile while calmly repeating, "Stop. It's over. Stop fighting." The entire sequence demonstrated something that Master Rivera had always taught, that the highest expression of martial arts skill isn't the ability to hurt someone, but the ability to completely control a situation while minimizing harm. The third attacker, seeing his two friends neutralized and recognizing that he'd badly miscalculated, ran. Webb and his other accomplice, once they understood that Daniel could have seriously hurt them but had chosen restraint, stopped resisting. Daniel released them, stepped back to a safe distance, And here's where the story takes its first surprising turn. Instead of celebrating his victory or seeking revenge for being attacked, Daniel asked if they were okay. He checked that Webb could breathe properly after being winded, asked if the man he'd thrown had hit his head on the ground, and when police arrived, called by Jennifer Morrison and other witnesses, Daniel's first statement wasn't about pressing charges. It was about making sure the attackers received medical evaluation and emphasizing that while they definitely assaulted him, he tried to use the minimum force necessary to protect himself. The video of the confrontation went viral within hours. Millions of people watched this skinny teenager with glasses methodically defend himself against three adult men, and the internet responded with predictable intensity. Some people celebrated Daniel as a hero, praising his skill and restraint. Others criticized the attackers with vicious glee, turning them into memes and jokes. But Daniel's response to his sudden internet fame revealed more about his character than the fight itself had. He gave a single interview to a local news station, and instead of celebrating his victory or demonizing his attackers, he talked about why violence should always be a last resort, about how scared he'd been despite his training, and about how he hoped this incident might lead to conversations about addressing the root causes that lead people to rob others in parks. He refused multiple offers from news networks, declined opportunities to monetize his viral fame, and asked people to stop harassing Webb and the other attackers online, noting that whatever mistakes they'd made, they deserved the chance to face legal consequences and potentially reform their lives without being destroyed by internet vigilantes. Master Carlos Rivera watched the video with mixed emotions. He was proud that Daniel had successfully defended himself and had demonstrated the restraint and ethics that Rivera taught, but he was troubled by how the video was being used by people with various agendas. Some martial arts schools used it as advertising, claiming they could teach anyone to fight like Daniel. Self-defense experts analyzed it frame by frame, often missing the point that Daniel's true skill wasn't in the techniques he used, but in the 8 years of consistent training that made those techniques instinctive. And perhaps most troubling, some people treated the video as entertainment, as violence to be celebrated rather than a scary situation that Daniel had been forced into against his will. Rivera gave his own interview, emphasizing that what happened in that park wasn't something to glorify, that Daniel had been put in a situation no one should face, and that the goal of martial arts training should be to develop the confidence and awareness to avoid such situations, not to seek them out. The legal aftermath of the incident was complex. Marcus Webb and his accomplice were arrested and charged with attempted robbery and assault. The third attacker who'd fled was identified through the video and eventually turned himself in. All three faced serious criminal charges, and the video evidence made conviction virtually certain. But here's where Daniel did something that shocked almost everyone. He wrote a letter to the district attorney asking that the charges be reduced and that the men be offered a plea deal emphasizing rehabilitation over purely punitive punishment. Daniel explained that he'd done research on recidivism rates, that he'd learned about how criminal records make it nearly impossible for people to rebuild their lives, and that while he believed they should face consequences, he didn't want to be responsible for destroying their futures entirely. He offered to meet with them as part of a restorative justice process if they were willing to talk about what had happened and why, and to potentially help them understand the impact of their actions. This request generated intense debate. Victims' rights advocates argued that Daniel was being too lenient, that these men had made choices to commit violent crimes and deserved whatever punishment the law prescribed. Others, particularly those working in criminal justice reform, praised Daniel's approach as the kind of thinking that could actually break cycles of crime and incarceration. The district attorney, moved by Daniel's letter but also accountable to public safety, offered a compromise. If the three men pleaded guilty, completed an intensive rehabilitation program, paid restitution, and participated in the restorative justice process that Daniel had proposed, they could potentially avoid the maximum sentences they faced. All three accepted the offer, and 6 months after the park incident, Daniel sat in a mediated session with Marcus Webb and the 2 other men who'd attacked him. That restorative justice session, facilitated by a trained mediator and conducted in private, became a turning point for everyone involved. Webb and his accomplices, who'd expected to meet a vindictive victim celebrating their punishment, instead encountered a teenager who asked them questions about their lives with genuine curiosity. Daniel wanted to know what circumstances had led them to rob people in parks, what they'd been feeling that day, whether they'd considered that their victims might be traumatized beyond just losing property. Webb, who'd built his identity around toughness and had never really examined his own choices, found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected. He talked about growing up in poverty, about how masculinity in his community was defined by dominance and violence, about how he dropped out of high school and fallen into crime because it seemed like the only path available. He talked about the shame he felt watching that video, seeing himself as a bully and a predator, recognizing that he'd become exactly the kind of person he'd hated when he was a vulnerable kid himself. Daniel listened without judgment, and then he shared his own story about watching his father get beaten during a robbery, about the fear and helplessness that had driven him to martial arts, about learning that true strength meant protecting others and controlling yourself rather than dominating people weaker than you. He explained that when Webb had attacked him in the park, Daniel had seen not just a threat, but another human being making terrible choices, and that even in that moment of defending himself, he'd been trying not to cause unnecessary harm. That perspective, that even in the midst of being victimized, Daniel had maintained concern for his attacker's well-being, hit Webb with more force than any punch Daniel had thrown. Webb broke down crying, something he hadn't done since childhood, and apologized with a sincerity that went beyond just wanting leniency. He apologized for the violence, for the trauma, for being the kind of person who'd attack a kid reading a book, and he thanked Daniel for giving him a chance at redemption he didn't deserve. The impact of that restorative justice session extended far beyond the individuals in the room. Daniel and Master Rivera worked with the facilitator to create a program pairing at-risk youth and formerly incarcerated adults with martial arts training, not primarily as self-defense, but as a framework for teaching discipline, respect, and alternative masculinity models that didn't equate strength with violence. Webb, once he completed his rehabilitation program, became involved with the program himself, speaking to young people about his mistakes and the consequences of violence. He became living proof that people could change, that one terrible choice didn't have to define someone's entire life, and that accountability paired with opportunity could break cycles that punishment alone never could. The program, called Strength in Control, expanded to multiple gyms across Portland and eventually to other cities, helping hundreds of young people develop the kind of character that Daniel had demonstrated in that park. Daniel's viral fame eventually faded, as internet attention always does, but the lessons from his story continued to resonate. Self-defense instructors across the country began emphasizing not just technique, but ethics, teaching students about de-escalation and proportional response using Daniel's example. Conversations about restorative justice and rehabilitation over purely punitive punishment gained momentum, with Daniel's letter to the district attorney being cited as an example of what victims might want if given real choice in how justice was pursued. And perhaps most significantly, the video became a teaching tool for young people about what real strength looks like, not the bravado and aggression that our culture often celebrates, but the discipline to train seriously, the wisdom to avoid violence when possible, and the character to show mercy even to those who'd shown you none. 3 years after the park incident, Daniel was 19 and attending college on a full scholarship, studying conflict resolution and restorative justice with plans to work in criminal justice reform. He'd earned his purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and continued training regularly, though he remained private about his martial arts background and uncomfortable with the attention he'd received. He stayed in occasional contact with Marcus Webb, who'd completed his rehabilitation program, found steady employment, and was training in martial arts himself at Master Rivera's gym, not because Daniel had asked him to, but because Webb had recognized that the discipline and philosophy that Daniel embodied were things he desperately needed in his own life. Their unlikely friendship became a symbol of the program they'd helped create, proof that even the worst encounters could lead to transformation and redemption if people chose growth over vengeance. Master Rivera, reflecting on everything that had emerged from that day in the park, often told his students that Daniel's story represented the ultimate test of martial arts training. Not the physical techniques Daniel had used, but the character he'd demonstrated before, during, and after the confrontation. Rivera emphasized that anyone could learn to throw punches or execute takedowns with enough practice, but developing the wisdom to de-escalate first, the restraint to use minimum necessary force, and the compassion to seek rehabilitation for attackers rather than pure punishment. That required years of not just physical training, but moral and philosophical development. He used Daniel's example to push back against the toxic elements of martial arts culture that glorified violence and encouraged students to seek confrontation as a way to prove themselves. If you take one lesson from Daniel Kim's story, let it be this: true strength isn't about the ability to hurt people. It's about the character to choose not to when you have the power. Daniel spent 8 years training to fight, and in his moment of testing, he fought well. But his real strength was demonstrated in everything he did afterward, in checking on the welfare of men who just tried to rob him, in advocating for their rehabilitation instead of maximum punishment, in turning a viral moment into an opportunity for teaching and transformation rather than personal glory. That's the kind of strength that changes lives and communities, that breaks cycles of violence instead of perpetuating them, that makes the world genuinely better rather than just providing temporary satisfaction. Here's what I want you to do. First, if you're considering martial arts training, find instructors like Master Rivera who emphasize ethics and discipline alongside technique, who teach that the goal is personal development rather than dominance over others. Second, examine your own relationship with violence and strength. Are you celebrating the ability to hurt people, or are you developing the character to protect people, including those who might wish you harm? Third, support restorative justice approaches in your community that focus on rehabilitation and accountability rather than purely punitive punishment. And finally, remember that how you respond to people who wrong you reveals more about your character than what you do when everything's going well. If this story challenged how you think about strength, self-defense, and justice, hit that like button and subscribe for more content that explores the deeper meaning behind viral moments and the character that emerges from difficult situations. Share this with young people in your life who might benefit from understanding what real strength looks like. Drop a comment telling us about times you've had to show restraint when you had the power to retaliate, or about how martial arts or other disciplines have shaped your character. Because Daniel Kim's story proves that the strongest among us aren't those who can inflict the most damage. They're those who can choose mercy, seek understanding, and turn conflict into opportunities for growth and redemption.